Good morning. As most of you have noticed, Linda is back. She was not only on the organ this morning, but I'm obviously grateful that she came back 2 days ago from Canada. And while she was away, I learned one very important lesson, which was do not water the artificial plants. I actually had a number of people express, and I appreciate it, asking me if I was okay being by myself for 3 weeks and everything. And yeah, I actually can cook and can do all the things you would normally do, so it was fine, but I certainly missed her, and I'm certainly glad she's back. Last week we started talking about some questions that were being asked of Paul, and Paul was addressing because people were essentially saying God has not done what he said he was going to do, saying that God was either not faithful to his word or that somehow it was God's fault that Israel had fallen away. And what we're finding is that's simply not true. We talked about things like the excluded middle last week and how there were other options. What we're going to do today is we're going to continue onward, not so much from that, but he's really answering the same question as we go on. And the first thing we're seeing is God didn't abandon Israel. Israel walked away from God. So again, it wasn't God's fault. But now we're also going to see when Paul gets to the point of saying, you know something? There's a reason this is happening, and not only for the Gentiles, but also for the Jews as well. Now we start in verse 11. Verse 11 starts with, I say then, they did not stumble as to fall, did they? May it never be, but by their transgression salvation has come to the Gentiles to make them jealous. The first thing I notice here is some kind of a weird sentence where it says, they did not stumble as to fall, did they? Well, that's kind of a weird way of phrasing it, isn't it? You might not understand it. If you lived in my house and watched me, you would understand it. Because frequently I will walk into walls, I'll walk into columns, I'll walk upstairs and fall flat on my face, and sometimes it is stumbling as to fall, where I end up falling up the stairs and I'm flat on my face by the time I'm done. Other times it's just stumbling, I bounce into a few walls and keep right on walking. Well, in this case, I think what we got to look at is, what he's saying is, Israel tripped, Israel stumbled, but God's not putting them away for good. Instead, what you've got to look at is the stumbling was rejecting Christ. They had the Messiah right there. They had the ability to take the Messiah as their king, and they refused to do it because they wanted a military ruler as opposed to a spiritual king. The point being, though, is that God didn't say, this is the end for you. God still is protecting a remnant. We dealt with a remnant beforehand, and this remnant is going to be preserved. Today, the remnant that's being preserved are Jews that are being saved just like Gentiles are being saved. By faith, through Christ, no different. And it's always been by faith and always been through grace. But again, in the church age, we can see it's not a different gospel or something of that nature. Now, the other thing interesting in this is after Paul talks about stumbling, his next response is, may it never be. And the exclamation point is added in the English because there is no punctuation in the original. This is a phrase we've seen over and over again, including earlier in chapter 11. And my way of expressing it in English is, no way. And that's really what Paul's saying here over and over again. This simply isn't true. And what he's responding to in chapters 9 through 11 is all these accusations about all the things that God did wrong. If only God knew better, he wouldn't have done it this way. Well, instead, every time Paul is like, no way. That's just not true. So we see that there. The other thing we see here is it says that, but by their transgression, salvation has come to the Gentiles. Now what's he talking about? By the transgression of the Jews. What's he mean? One of the things we have to understand, it's very easy to look at the Jews and say, well, if only they would have just been smart enough to see Jesus was king, this would have been all. We don't want to look down on them because that's not what Paul's doing here. But their transgression, interestingly enough, I believe, centered around following the law and not following God. Because if you think about it, one thing we miss a lot of times is if you would have seen the religious Jews of that day and you would have lived in that day, you would have looked at them and gone, wow, these guys are holy. These guys are spiritual. I mean, when Christ talked about whited sepulchres, he's talking about something with death and rot inside, but that looked pretty on the outside. That's what he's talking about. I don't know how many of you ever did Pinewood Derby when you were a kid, but when I grew up, I was a Cub Scout, and we would always do Pinewood Derby every year, and if you're not familiar with that, you start with a block of wood, And then you get out your whittling knife, your pocket knife, and you're told things like, do not whittle this way, whittle that way. I mean, you have instructions on that. Always put the knife and go away from yourself. But the first year I ever did this, I sat down and I just came up with the ultimate car. I mean, this car was not only carved beautifully, it was painted beautifully. You put wheels on it, obviously, and then you put it on a big track and you roll down the track. This had like numbers on the side. This had a little plastic driver in the driver's seat. This had the tailpipes going down the side, where it went down the side, you know, the silver tailpipes, the chrome on it, and everything. I mean, this car was a tripped out car, okay? All for the Pinewood Derby race, and it was my first one. And you take the cars, and what you do is you take 4 at a time, you put them on the top of this track. The track just goes like, you know, straight down at an angle, rather. And it's all gravity that takes over at that point in time. They flip a lever, all the cars go like this. Actually, that's not true. 3 of the cars in my race went like this. My car went like this, okay? Because what I had this wonderful tripped out car, and I had these tailpipes coming down the side that I didn't know, but when you put it on the track, that were rubbing against the wheels. So my car was going about 1/4 the speed of all the other cars. I mean, you know, like, the other people, they finish the race, they get their car, they go have lunch, and they're still waiting for my car to finish, okay? But that car looked beautiful. It was a gorgeous car. Very similar to the Jews of that day. Religiously, they looked gorgeous on the outside. By the way, the following year I entered the same race. I forgot to get a new car. I took that car, I got so mad at it, I took my knife and just started carving all over the thing. Chopped it into like this block so it was not even any paint on the thing. Ripped all the chrome off the thing, said, here, slap it on the track. Ended up winning the first heat and got second place in the second heat. But anyway, the point is, it wasn't what the outside looked like that mattered. How fast did it go on the car? You know something? What the outside looked like on the Jews of that day didn't make any difference. It looked great on the outside. Yeah, but it was death and rot on the inside. It was religion without Christ. It's worthless. And what we see is they looked good, but they turned away from God. They followed the law, but missed the point of the law. And because of that, salvation came to the Gentiles. Now, what's interesting here is God planned Gentile salvation all along. It wasn't like God's going along, He brings along the Messiah gets crucified, and God goes, oh no, now what do? I better save somebody. That wasn't what happened. You look back in the Old Testament, there's passage after passage from the prophets talking about the Gentiles that are going to be worshiping God. God planned this all along. But what's interesting here is it wasn't just about the Gentiles, it was also about the Jews. Because he says here, Paul said, to make them jealous. Think about it. We have the Jewish inheritance. And that was deliberate. See, we often think of jealousy as a bad thing, and typically it is a bad thing. You hear the green-eyed monster and everything else. Well, you know something? Jealousy can also provoke someone to action, good or bad action. You know, pick up a hammer and chase somebody, bad action. Decide that you're going to work hard and do something differently and change your life, good action. And what's happening here wasn't so much that they would change their lives as far as working harder, but the jealousy was to see, wait a second, they've got your inheritance. And now he was hoping that at least some of the Jews would look at it and go, wait a second, I need to find out about Christ. That was the purpose of it, as well as Gentile salvation. It's funny because I talked about jealousy provoking us to hard work. I heard something about a month ago that I couldn't believe. MSNBC had a story where they now said you can no longer use the word hard work or hardworking because somehow it's a derogatory term. I still have not figured it out. But if you think I'm kidding, it actually happened. I can't make this stuff up. I wish I could. But how hard work and hardworking is now somehow a derogatory term. There's nothing wrong with being jealous of something, and instead of getting jealous and acting wrong, saying, you know something, I'm going to change my life. But in this case, it's not a matter of changing and working to get better. It's a matter of sitting down and saying, but to the Jews there, hey, we need Christ, we need grace, we need to get back to what the law was about originally. Now, if we go to verse 12, we see, now if their transgression be riches for the world, and their failure be riches for the Gentiles, how much more will their fulfillment be? What's he talking about? Remember, it's the Israelites' fall that caused the Gentile salvation. But at some point in time, they're coming back. God is going to fulfill things to them. And this was planned all along, and what he's saying is, when they come back, God's going to rejoice. Almost like the story of the prodigal son, but instead of an individual, he's talking about a group of people that's going to come back. And again, these are no matter, something else, as Gentiles, we can, most of our Gentiles, we may have some Jews here too, that's fine, but as Gentiles predominantly, we can look at things and go, we're God's chosen people, but you know something? We can never say we were the first chosen people. The Jews were. God picked them. And I think there is something special about that. I think that's something where there is going to be great rejoicing when they come back. Not just because they come back, but because they're the original ones God chose. But they have to come back on the terms of Jesus Christ and the Messiah through salvation, through grace and faith, not on their own terms, not in terms of the law. It's not going to work. If we go to chapter 13, or verses 13 through 15, we start in 13. It says, "But I am speaking to you who are Gentiles. Inasmuch then as I am an apostle of Gentiles, I magnify my ministry, if somehow I might move to jealousy my fellow countrymen and save some of them." First thing we have to see here is, remember, Paul was designated as the apostle to the Gentiles. That was God's decision to make him. He needed somebody to go out and evangelize the Gentile world. And if you look at it, what happened? The churches of Asia Minor, they were all Gentile churches. Primarily, Paul went out and evangelized them. Paul was training them. Paul established a lot of them. He was the apostle to the Gentiles. So what he's saying is, if I just concentrate on the Gentiles and nobody else, I'm going to make myself look good. Because I'm the apostle of the Gentiles, Gentile church is growing, look, this is going to make me look good. But what he's also saying is, you know something? No matter how good this may make me look, I still have a heart for my brothers. My ethnic brothers, my Jews that I have left that I'm following Christ and they're not. So that's what Paul's getting at here is, in these verses, what he's saying is, even though I'm the apostle to the Gentiles, I still care about my own flesh and blood. And I can understand what he's saying. It's hard to cut off your own flesh and blood. The fact is that the rejection of the Jews brought salvation to the rest of the world, but it also meant death for most of the Jews. And Paul was upset about that. Now, the other thing I want to talk about here is I want to take kind of not a timeout, but a sidestep here that I normally would save till later. But what I want to talk about for a second is, if the Jews are to be provoked to jealousy to be saved, how are we to witness to the Jews? I don't know about you, but I've actually had a lot of Jewish friends and witnessed to a lot of Jewish friends. And it's different than witnessing to Gentiles in some cases. But the key here, and some tips I'm going to give you on this, is identifying the type of Jew they are and how to talk to them. And the reason I say this, it's almost like saying, how do you witness to a Gentile? Well, you know something? A middle-class American versus someone from, I don't know, whatever, from versus the Philippines, versus Africa, versus Europe, versus Asia. It's not like there's one Gentile and you just learn how to witness to him and you're done. Somehow we kind of get in that mindset with the Jews. But here's the first thing to look at is, number one, is this a Jew who is still a believer in God, the God of the Bible, the Old Testament? And they don't call it the Old Testament, by the way. But the point is this someone who actually believes in God? Because if it's someone who believes in God and understands the law and has an understanding of that, my recommendation to you is start with that. Start by talking about the fact that, yes, I believe that absolutely the Bible is inspired, that God actually wrote this. I believe that the prophets that God sent to Israel were the prophets. I believe, in Abraham, the father of the Jews. I believe the Jews are the chosen people, etc. And gradually plant seeds to lead them to the fact that, this Messiah you've been waiting for, he's here. Look at the claims of the Old Testament. And the point is that I think that's an effective way to witness to a Jew sometimes who is a God-fearing, Bible-believing Jew, but in his own, not as we call the Bible, but his own belief in God. On the other hand, we also I've had many Jewish friends who really, they're ethnically Jewish, but don't have a clue about the Bible. They really don't. I'm talking the Old Testament for them. They don't have a clue about it. in those cases, I normally witness to them pretty much like they're a Gentile. Now, I might bring up about the chosen people or something sometime, but the point being is you kind of have to look and determine, what does this person know? Where's this person coming from? And when we're witnessing to Jews, and something else, just because it's tough to witness to the Jews because there's only a remnant left, doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing it. By the way, there have been some heretical preachers who have taught things like, the Gentiles today have one way of salvation, the Jews have another way of salvation. Well, gee, that'd be a surprise to the Apostle Paul. No, there was one way of salvation, period. And we shouldn't be afraid to witness to Jews in a loving, friendly way. I've had a lot of Jewish friends, and I think it's great to be able to share with, especially when you hit somebody who actually understands the Old Testament and you can talk to them about it, and frankly, I've learned stuff from them. But again, find out who they are. Don't just sit there and hit them with a gospel grenade. First find out, what do they actually believe? Where are they coming from? And then the message can be tailored to them. Now, one other particular challenge which I'm going to say that you're going to face if you're witnessing to a Jew is that many Jews have an idea of what Christianity is, and they don't have any clue as to what Christianity actually is. And one of the problems you've got is when you look at who has claimed to be a Christian, okay? One of the first things you'll hear from a lot of Jews is, well, Hitler was a Christian. Really? I don't know if you know this or not, but Hitler, when he took over in Germany, required that the churches remove the Bible from the altar and put a copy of Mein Kampf on the middle of the altar. That doesn't sound like a Christian to me. And if you actually start looking at what Hitler actually believed, he was actually horrible to the evangelical churches because he had nothing in common with them. Hitler's beliefs were no way Christian, yet somehow that label has been slapped on him, and usually what that label means is not Jewish. And frankly, a lot of times, to the Jews, a lot of times, not Jewish equates to Christian or Gentile. So again, there can be roadblocks. There's also roadblocks like, you've got people in the past, the Ku Klux Klan, who put a cross that they bring out and everything. They've got no more to do with Christianity than penguins do. It's got nothing to do with Christianity, yet to a person who doesn't understand Christianity, when you're witnessing to a Jew, a lot of times, they may not know that. They've just seen the symbolism. They don't realize, hey, this is not Christianity. And even if you don't go to those extremes, we have people like Westboro Baptist. I normally don't mention churches by name, but they're a very extreme church. They're the ones that are protesting at the funerals and things like that. I don't have any idea if they're Christians or not. I can't tell you for sure what's in their heart, but I can tell you this. They're certainly not acting like it, and the problem is, when they're out there, it makes Christianity look bad. So you're going to fight challenges like that more than just most people. But if you've done much witnessing to Jews, you're going to find this gets thrown up in your face. Don't be offended by it. Yeah, well, these people weren't Christians, or these were, and something else. A lot of times, some of the things they're offended by are things that legitimate believers have done that shouldn't have done. As believers, we're going to do things we shouldn't do. Instead of avoiding it, talk to them about it. Be honest, be open. But I'm just trying to prepare you. Don't just write off, I can't witness to the Jews. Find your Jewish friends and talk to them. But listen to them. Hear them. Understand what they're saying and where they're coming from. And as you find that, and as you listen to them, you're going to understand how to approach them. And just be aware of these obstacles. Okay, there's an obstacle. They're going to see certain people as horrible things Christians did. Some true, some not true. Point being is, as long as you're aware of it, you can talk to them. Let's continue on in the text here. As I said, that was kind of an aside, but I think sometimes it's important to realize how to witness to certain people groups that we don't necessarily think about. In verse 16, it continues, "And if the first piece of dough be holy, the lump is also. And if the root be holy, the branches are too." One of the things we're going to see in 16 through 22 is this is a metaphor. And you have to be a little careful when looking at a metaphor about getting every last thing to line up exactly as you see it. Because sometimes it's a story to tell you, to illustrate something. Essentially, it's like a sermon illustration almost, okay? Not an allegory, which is different, because we reject allegories, but this is a metaphor. Now, when we look at this section, the one thing I had to do, and I did this quite a while ago, was when it talks about the lump, I actually had to go to my wife and say, what's this talking about? Well, from her background, she knew you start with a lump of dough and you keep You put yeast in it, and you keep adding to it, and the yeast keeps growing, and evidently, I don't know, if I remember correctly, you leave this lump on the counter or whatever, and you use it over and over and over again, okay? And the lump just keeps growing because it's literally a living thing with the yeast. Now, when you think about that, and you start thinking about what this lump is, you realize if you start with a bad lump, you're going to get a bad loaf. I don't care what you do. It doesn't make any difference. You don't start with bad dough and suddenly that bad dough becomes wonderful bread. You know, I don't know about you, but I like to cook. I don't do it that often, but I like to cook. And a lot of times, instead of following a recipe, I'll make up my own recipes. And frequently they turn out very nicely. And occasionally there'll be that flavor in one of them or an ingredient in one of them that's just like, that just wasn't quite right. And my natural instinct is, well, I'll add this, and by the time it's done, it's just a horrible mess. Sometimes when you put the wrong, you put sour milk into a cake mix, throw it out, start over again, do a new cake, get new milk. It's that simple. Unless it calls for sour milk, but the point, and there are a few that do. But the point is that if you got bad ingredients to start with, you're going to have problems. It's also, if that doesn't ring a bell, think about a paint job. If you didn't do the prep work on those walls, I don't care if you put 500 coats of paint on there, it's not going to look right. You're still going to have dings on the wall, you're going to have plaster missing and everything else. The first thing you got to do, take it down to whatever you need to, patch it up, put the stuff on it, then after it's all sanded and ready to go, then you paint it. Similar here. If the lump is bad, you're not getting anything good out of the lump. And not only the lump, but it also talks about the root. Okay? If the root is bad, now I am not really into gardening. Surprise, surprise. However, I've watched a little gardening, I've listened to Linda about gardening, I've learned from others about gardening, and one of the things that I found is that you frequently graft plants. Especially roses and things like that. You graft these plants on, and you take one plant and put it onto a healthy root so that the root will be strong. Because some plants, their roots, they're beautiful plants, but they're just not strong enough to survive on their own. Now, why is Paul talking about roots and lumps and all this stuff here? Here's the answer. Jesus Christ is the root. Jesus Christ is the lump. And if you don't have Jesus Christ at the center of your religion, I don't care what your religion or spirituality is, it's worthless, period. That's simple. Jesus Christ and the message, which is Christ came to pay for our sins. It's by grace through faith alone. He died for our sins as a propitiation. He rose from the dead, physically and literally. He is God Himself. That's the message. That's what we're getting at here. And if you don't have that as the root, nothing else matters. You can have a wonderful religion, but a wonderful religion without Jesus Christ is worthless. It's death. And that's all it is. Now, if we continue looking in verse 17. Verse 17 says, "But if some of the branches were broken off, and you, being a wild olive, were grafted in among them, and became partaker of them of the rich root of the olive tree, do not be arrogant toward the branches. But if you are arrogant, remember that it is not you who supports the root, but the root supports you." First thing we have to see here is the natural branches are Israel. Those are the ones who were chosen by God originally. So if we miss that, we miss the metaphor. And God chose them. Second thing, if you think about it, is the Gentiles who now have salvation, the Gentiles by nature had no knowledge whatsoever of the law originally, had no knowledge of God, had no knowledge. I mean, they knew about a God that may have been worshipped or something, and they make little idols too and things like that. But go back and look at the history. The Gentiles were not running around saying, "Oh, we got to find out who this Jewish God is." No, very rarely did that happen. I'm not saying there weren't a few exceptions. Very rarely did that happen. The Gentiles were never part of the promise to Abraham. So essentially, as Gentiles, we have been grafted into this root. Now, the first thing you should know about also is it talks about us being the wild olives, the Gentiles being the wild olives. Wild olives were known for one thing, or two things actually: having branches everywhere and not bearing fruit. The energy went into the branches, not the fruit. So you can get olives from wild olives. You might get a few, but you're not going to get anything. You're not going to get anything you're going to want. It's the cultivated olives that produce the fruit. It's the natural, the cultivated ones that have been taken care of. So essentially what he's saying is, wild olives, which are you, has been grafted onto this good root. The point being, by nature, we don't produce fruit. Gentiles don't produce fruit. We don't know about God. We're not part of the promise. We don't have any of these things. On the other hand, once we've been grafted in, the root is Jesus Christ, all of a sudden, yeah, we'll produce fruit. And it's funny, if you've seen roses, it's often very beautiful to see the hybrid tea roses and the hybrid roses and things like that. From what I understand, and from what I've seen in the past, they don't just sell you the hybrid rose just like it is and nothing else. They graft that rose onto the solid root of the wild rose because it's sturdier and because it's healthier. And the point is, in this case, we as the wild olives have been grafted onto Jesus Christ, essentially. And again, it's a metaphor here, so don't go into every little detail of this, but the point is that without Jesus Christ, our religion is worthless. We can be spiritual, but it doesn't make any difference. It also talks here about not being arrogant, which makes a lot of sense. I mean, think about it. It's very easy for us to kind of look down and say, oh, well, look, we got it and they don't now. That's not the point of this. If we continue in verse 19, verse 19 says, you will say, talking about arrogance again, you will say then, branches were broken off so that I might be grafted in. Quite right, they were broken off for their unbelief, but you stand by faith. Do not be conceited, but fear. For if God did not spare the natural branches, neither will he spare you. Behold then the kindness and severity of God to those who fell, severity to you, God's kindness if you continue in his kindness, otherwise you will also be cut off. If we look at verses 19 and 20, we see again, I don't believe God's talking about individual salvation here. I think he's talking about a group that's been grafted in. If you start taking these verses and saying this is talking about each individual, you run into problems because all of a sudden you have individuals gaining and losing salvation and going back and forth. I think instead what he's saying is the Gentiles have been brought in as a group. But guys, you want to stand up there and talk about how good you are? You can be cut off too, just like they were. And if you look in 21, it says, not sparing the natural branches. We are not better than the Jews. They were cut off, we can be cut off. And again, as a group we're talking about here. And again, when I say group, obviously I don't mean everyone in the group saved. Just as with Israel, something to remember. Israel was chosen, but not everybody in Israel is saved. It was only those who put their faith in the Messiah that were saved. So being chosen as a group doesn't mean that every individual is going to be saved. Now today, when God chooses us, yes, that's talking about individuals that are saved. But in this particular metaphor, he's talking about groups. And one of the areas we need to understand that is when we get to verse 22, because it says, behold then, the kindness and severity of God to those who fell severely, but to you. Let me go back to this. If we look at this, verse 22 raises two quick questions we've got to answer. The first question is, God is kind and severe. It kind of makes it look like God's responsible for the bad behavior, doesn't it? After all, if God's kind to some people and he's really, just a jerk to other people, well, isn't it really God's fault they act the way they do? Well, the first thing we've got to remember is no one deserves God's grace. Everyone is a sinner by nature. So the fact is that God's kindness is given by God because he chooses to do so. He is not under obligation to give kindness to everyone. So that doesn't make it God's fault again. Again, everybody, this whole section 9 through 11, all these things are being thrown up. How's it God's fault, not our fault? It's not God's fault. God can choose to be kind to anyone because by nature, every one of us deserves God's wrath. By nature. I'm talking Jew, Gentile, anybody else, because we're all sinners. The second question that comes up in this verse is this talking about a loss of salvation? Because it says, but to you, God's kindness, if you continue in his kindness. Otherwise, you will be cut off. Here's why I had to bring up about individual versus groups here. If this is individual salvation, what it's saying is, essentially get yourself saved, and then if you keep working long enough and properly enough, you'll stay saved. That's not what it's saying. It's talking about the groups here, because remember, he's talking about Israel being cut off. He's not talking about every individual believer in Israel or not, or non-believer. Israel was cut off. With the Gentiles, something we have to remember. Gentiles are going to be cut off, at least to some degree. There'll still be a remnant of Gentiles saved in the tribulation. But you get to the tribulation, it's going to be a Jewish revival. And the Gentiles are the ones that are falling away. So what he's saying is, look, don't get so high and mighty because as a group God brought you in for salvation. It's always going to be open to anyone who has faith in the Messiah. But by the same token, don't get all up here high and mighty about we're better than the Jews are because we didn't reject Christ. Yeah, I've heard that before. Well, it was the Jews who killed Christ. Oh, come on. Actually, if you want to get technical, it was the Romans that killed Christ. But it doesn't make any difference. Christ died to pay the propitiation to satisfy the wrath of God for every single individual. Jew, Gentile, whatever category you want to come up with, every one of us is responsible for Christ's death. And every one of us is the reason why Christ went to that cross. So it has nothing to do with who physically sent him to the cross or who nailed him to the cross or who did anything else. It doesn't make any difference. It's not for us to be looking down on another group to say, hey, we wouldn't have done that. Yeah, we would have. We would have done the same thing most likely. Now that we've interpreted here, I want to go to some applications. Number one, provoking each other to jealousy. In this passage, God's talking specifically about provoking Jews to come to Christ, salvation. But you know something? There's something we can learn from this. Have you ever noticed that if you're glorifying God and enough other people are glorifying God around you, it's easier to glorify God and do the right thing? I mean, it is. It's just easier when other people are doing the right thing. I remember many years ago, I spent, back when I was in late teens, probably for about 2 years, me and a couple of friends would go down every Saturday, take the metro down, and we would set up an art board and start preaching at 11th and F in front of Woodward and Lothrop's, if you remember what that is in this area. And you know something? In those couple of years, I don't remember a single person coming to Christ. But you know what I did see? I did see seeds planted, but I saw something else. I had believers walk up to me and say, wow, if you can do this, I could be doing more to tell people around me about Christ. I was surprised how many believers actually came up and were actually convicted by the fact that they weren't doing enough to tell people about Christ. It was a witness not just to unbelievers, but to believers as well, because good works spur good works. By the same token, the opposite is true as well, not just in the church, but elsewhere. It's funny because every time I need a sermon illustration on the evils of man or something, it's almost like God just says, go for a drive, I'll give you some illustrations. The other week, I was on 197, and first I nearly got hit by a car that was texting and never even knew they had almost hit me. Okay, that's normal. Then I'm driving a little further, and there's cars speeding down the shoulder. Okay, well, I've seen that too. Then a car gets to a turn in the road, and literally as they turn, this pickup truck just takes a bag full of trash and just heaves it out the window. And I'm thinking like, you gotta be kidding. What's wrong with you little, I don't know, you sociopath or whatever? I don't know who the person was. I couldn't even see the person. But it's like, who would do that? But you know something? You know why you see that? Because other people do that. And I'm not talking Christians here. I don't have any idea if this person's Christian or not. But the point, I'm hoping it wasn't a witness for Christ, to be honest with you. But the point is, when you see people tossing trash into the street, it's a little more natural to toss trash into the street. And if everybody's doing it, all of a sudden, no big deal. I mean, it's funny. In my neighborhood, I look around and I'm thinking like Linda and I, we are like the last two people in our neighborhood to stop for stop signs anymore or even know what they are, I think. I mean, it just, right through everyone, especially on the side streets, okay? But think about it. If everybody were stopping for the stop signs, it'd stand out. And not only that, the police would be able to sit there and pick off the, well, you didn't stop. On the other hand, when nobody stops, it's just the way it is. Now, that's an example from the world, but you know something? When we in the church start acting like the world, we're going to discourage other believers from glorifying God and following God. how we act doesn't just affect us and God and even unbelievers, it also affects the believers around us. Not only that, if you're going out to witness, if you're going out for visitation, if you're going to come to a Bible study, whatever. Do you know how lonely a Bible study is if you're a teacher and there's nobody there sitting in the class? Or, one person shows up, and if that person, I'm glad they're there. But if one person shows up and you go, this is going to be boring or whatever. But if nobody shows up, what's the point of it? You know something? If we go out as groups and do things, if we encourage other believers, hey, I'm going to the Bible study, you come to the Bible, things like that. Are you going to Sunday school? You know something? Sunday school, we have training where we go deeper than we do here, and we learn and study the Bible, and it's open to everybody, not just in this church, but anybody else who wants to show up at it. We get a number of people there, but we get an awful lot of people who don't show up too. But the more people that are involved, the more it will spur other people. And I'm not just talking about activities. Live a godly life. Live a life that our goal is to glorify God, period. Everything fits under glorifying God for a believer. You find that from Ephesians chapter 1. And the point is that as we do that, we're going to encourage other believers around us without even trying to. And as we turn away from that and act like the world, we're going to do the same thing and turn other believers away from us as well. The next thing I want to look at is that God turned his back on Israel, but by application, I shouldn't say, God turned away from Israel temporarily. He's going to restore them. But God can turn away from churches as a group. I think there are a lot of people today in the world that are in churches where the church as a whole is dead, period. Dead as a doornail, just as dead as if you were going to anywhere else in the world. When I look back at my relatives and where I came from, I have a number of different branches of the family. I've done genealogical tracings for actually the oldest branch is a little over 2,000 years. The point being is, if I go back several hundred years, what I find in Pennsylvania is a lot of my relatives came from the Reformed Church. I didn't even know what the Reformed Church was when I first started studying this 30, 40 years ago. But a lot of my relatives come from the Reformed Church, which was actually a pretty decent gospel-preaching church back then. Probably a different form than we're used to, but a pretty decent gospel-preaching church. Well, the Reformed Church eventually turned into the United Church of Christ. United Church of Christ is a dead church. I'm not talking Church of Christ here. There's a lot of variants here, so be careful. United Church of Christ. And what you're going to find is that's a church that basically has just turned completely... I don't even know why they meet on Sunday mornings other than socials. And I will never forget, and again, this is my own family history that's what bothered me. I will never forget finding a United Church of Christ church up in Massachusetts that on their off days rather, was making their sanctuary available to witches so they could meet there and hold their meetings in the church. Now, I'm not saying all the UCC churches are going that far, but that's how far that church has fallen. I don't think God is working in that church. You may find individual believers in it, okay? But God can turn his back on a church. And I think some of our mainline churches, maybe not the whole thing, but a lot of them, God's just saying, fine, you want it, you can have it. You can go your own way. How many of these churches do you know that reject inerrancy? How many of these churches that reject the resurrection? Oh yeah, Christ is a good spirit or something. He didn't physically rise from the dead. How about salvation through grace alone? Yeah, you start getting down to this and finding out, you know something? A lot of these churches don't really believe that anymore. And they may even have it in their doctrinal statement. But having it in their doctrinal statement and practicing it are two different things. They're falling away. And one thing we forget, look at the end times. If you look at Revelation, you look at Matthew, look at the various prophecies, the end times is the tribulation, for example, I think is going to be a very religious time. What do you mean religious time? There's going to be all kinds of garbage going on there. God striking people dead, the earth churning apart, everything else. No, it's going to be religious. I didn't say Christian, I said religious. Now, we are going to have the great witnesses, don't get me wrong, but there's going to be, it appears to be, an organized religion that's supporting the Antichrist, or supporting the beast as well. And I think we're going to have a one-world religion. Again, worthless without Jesus Christ. Many of our churches, we're not in the end times yet, at least not the final end times, But many of our churches, they're in a headlong race to get there because they're rejecting core doctrines that we believe in, like the resurrection. You cannot reject the resurrection and be called a Christian anymore. It's that simple. Can't do it. You cannot reject salvation by faith, by grace, and be a Christian. You can't do it. It's that simple. Yet many of our churches are doing that. Now, let me go in the other direction here for a minute, because I'm talking about God rejecting and set aside churches as a group. God cannot and never will turn his back on one of his children. Once you're a believer, I don't care what you do in your life, the Holy Spirit indwells you. The Holy Spirit seals you. You become a new creation, which is literally the Holy Spirit joining with you. That cannot be undone. Not only that, if we look at John 1:12, it says that Christ came so that we may become sons or children of God. That is a new relationship that's formed. That's not something that can be undone. God can't unadopt us. So on a group level, God can say, that's it, I've had it. But on an individual level, if you're a believer, there's no way in the world you can lose it, period. You're indwelt, you can't lose it. Remember, it's Christ's righteousness, not your righteousness. So what are you going to do that'll screw up Christ's righteousness? Now, I will say this, if you're a believer, God can discipline you. Not fun. But he can do that. But he won't turn his back on you, and he won't take his wrath out on you. And not only discipline you, God can, in some extreme cases, I believe God may actually kill believers. I got to get you out of the way. This is not the witness I want. It's like those times when you see a guy, doing 90 miles an hour up the shoulder, and you see a little fish on the back of his truck or his car, and all you can say is, I wish you hadn't put that fish there. I think there are times when God finally says, I wish you weren't doing that, and just has to take a believer home. It's not the norm, but I think it happens. But he still doesn't take his wrath out on the believer, and the believer still doesn't lose his salvation. Boy, that's comforting. That relationship is established and cannot go away. It's unbreakable. Not only that, if you are a believer sitting here today and you've done something in your life or things in your life, and you're saying to yourself, boy, if he only knew what I did, he wouldn't even be saying this to me because what I've done is so rotten. Oh, you mean like a guy who committed adultery and then murdered the husband of the woman he committed adultery with so that he could have her, right? You mean like King David, who God called a man after God's own heart. He did wrong, but he turned around. You mean like somebody who would go out and with Jesus Christ right there on earth, deny Jesus 3 times in one night? Oh, you mean Peter? You mean like somebody who would stand in the court of Pharaoh and stand in the other courts of the kings and lie about who his wife was? Oh, you mean Abraham instead of trusting in God? It wasn't that these people didn't sin, and sometimes horrible sins, but it was that they turned around, they repented. Repented literally means turning away, that they repented and came back. That's the key. There's nothing you have done that can stop that relationship, and there's nothing you have done that you can't repent of and say, I'm going to straighten this relationship out. I'm going to come back and glorify God and do what God wants me to do. Nothing. I don't care what you've done. Now, if it's horrible enough, you may end up glorifying God in prison for the rest of your life or something like that. I hope not, but hey. But wherever you end up, you can glorify God and turn back to Him. Now, one other thing I want to hit here briefly is that in the end, God will restore Israel. Now, let me say why that's important. Because it's one thing that, this is just history. We know our future history. That's a new word. I like that one. All right, this is future history we're talking about here. That God's going to restore Israel. You know something? That's not just a dry fact. You know what that is? That's God saying, I don't care what happens, I'm going to keep my word. And it's the same exact thing that God says to us. When He gives us His word, we can depend on it, period. It's not just if He feels like it. When He establishes a relationship with us, it's permanent. I find it very comforting that God's going to restore Israel and God's going to fulfill the promises to Israel, because it means God is trustworthy. And I'll tell you something else. When I have the worst times in my life or the best times in my life, but especially the worst, that's when it's comforting to say, you know something? No matter how bad things get, I can trust God. I know He's got a plan. I know He's got something in mind. No matter what happens in any of this, God will never turn His back on us. If you remember nothing else from this message, remember, if you're a believer, God will not turn His back on you. Maybe the most important thing we've spoken about this morning. Let's go ahead and close in prayer.